I'm Alfonso Winker.
And I'm Trina Olson. And together, we're the co-founders of Team Dynamics.
And this is Behave. Hi, friends, and welcome to Season 2. Trina, can you believe it is Season 2 of Behave already?
I'm so excited. You want to know mainly why?
Bring it on.
I think we're better than we were at the start of this.
No question. I at least know where to put my face in relationship to the, is it a spit screen?
Ooh, I don't think it's for spit.
Cough screen.
Just a screen. Okay, we still have a lot to learn.
Yes.
But I think what is exciting is that in Season 1, we got to begin a lot of conversations. We sort of peppered some topics really around workplace culture, thinking about the changing nature of the workplace, and thinking about how we're going to need to center conversations about identity if we are going to work to our optimum, right? And so I think this season I'm excited because maybe we can just go deeper. And, you know, with every year of practice on the ground, you and I rack up some more stories.
I love that. And part of why I love that is I love to make good on a promise.
Sure.
And I feel like I said a lot. I bet Levi could go back and listen and splice together a mashup of me saying, and we'll get into that deeper later, or it's something we're going to dig into more. This isn't the only conversation we're going to have about fill in the blank. And so it's like making good on things that we said we would do.
And I think my version of that is, and we'll stop here for today because this is as far as we can get, but there's more.
Yeah.
So Season 1 in some ways gave people a lot of actionable items. We got some great feedback. So thank you to all of our listeners, whether this is your first episode or you're coming back for Season 2. The feedback that you've given, the ratings, the likes have really helped to get this into more ears. So we really appreciate it. And I think now we can build. The only other thing I'll say, you and I like series of television shows.
Mm-hmm.
We especially like starting new television shows that have lots of seasons. And you know how on Netflix it says series, like Series 1, Series 2, Series 3. I'm excited to just see how far we can go. I don't know that we've got like Grey's Anatomy level series in us because they're on like season 75. Really 21, but it's like an enormous amount of episodes.
I mean, I could talk about race and gender ad nauseum.
Forever.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Well,
Here we go.
Let's do it. Season 2.
Woohoo!
That was a high five.
We, in Season 1, talked about conflict a little bit. Part of conflict, we said, was the fact that we can see our goals as incompatible or that we are emotionally upset. And one of the ways that we can be really clear about our own goals and around what things upset us emotionally is a conversation around boundaries.
Yeah, and just as a recap for folks, and feel free to go back to listen to that episode on conflict first. It'll give you some good grounding. We don't think anything about workplace conflict is bad, wrong, or even avoidable. And so exactly like you just said, emotional upset for us as managers is usually a good sign because it often means two things. Number one, people care about each other. So when they're not coming to a problem from the same vantage point, that's really hard, right? And often they really care about the work, which is great. And the idea of our goals being incompatible, whether or not it's true or it just feels true, we have got to start telling the truth and acknowledging the fact that if we put adults in a room day in and day out to be each other's colleagues, there is just no possible way that they can agree on everything all the time. So let's get ready and let's get better at how to handle, right, really smart adults who are trying their best to produce their best work and do not always see eye to eye.
So thanks for talking about how we miss each other and how we might not be on the same page all the time, or we might not be seeing things in the same way or experiencing things in the same way. And I think poor boundaries, implicit boundaries, lack of actually having boundaries, or the inability or fear of talking about or naming explicitly what our boundaries are could lead to some of that.
Yeah, and I really want to zoom into what you said about that implicit, because I think we walk around assuming our boundaries are clear. And I wish that was true. My lived experience is that is not at all true, because no matter what I think I'm communicating with, my body language, my facial expressions, even the words that I use, we cannot read one another's minds. It's impossible. And so we move through our day with different sets of boundaries for different constellations of people. And that doesn't make us inconsistent. That makes us conscious of our context, right? The boundaries I have with my nieces and how they want to physically be with me is going to be different than the boundaries I have with clients. And that makes sense. So I think often we can sort of fritz out mentally of the in and out we need to do when we're in relationships of, okay, what boundaries have I consented to in this space? What boundaries am I aware of? What am I trying to understand or pick up on? And the reason you and I say it's so powerful to practice noticing and naming boundaries and navigating them is if we can do that regularly, we'll stop guessing and then we'll stop missing each other and walking around resentful, irritated. Things won't sort of build up to a huge tipping point. And so this idea that boundaries are something we actually get to decide on day to day.
We've been saying the word boundaries a bunch in this conversation so far, and we like to borrow from one of our favorite authors, researchers, thought leaders, Dr. Brené Brown. She really unpacks in one of her TED Talks what she calls the anatomy of trust. And there's a bunch of different elements. Boundaries are the first element for her. And she very simply, and I think it almost blew me away how simple it was when I first came to her research about trust and boundaries.
Me too. Yeah.
Boundaries are what is okay and not okay for me.
Right. And as we think about the connected, conflated, confusing mashup that colleagues have with each other often in modern day America and its colonies, we are thinking about what is okay for me, but where I should stretch myself, where I think this doesn't feel good to me, but it's not against the technical boundary, or I don't know why this doesn't feel okay for me, or I got feedback that I did something and somebody didn't like it. And so I think the way that we talk about this isn't just to make ourselves feel better. We think it's a really helpful reframe. In US-based workplaces, we've been working with over 50 organizations in the last 2 years. Folks are simply unpracticed at navigating, naming, and co-creating boundaries. So, Alfonso, I'm curious, because you've been in the workplace for more than a decade. What are some boundaries that you have developed for yourself, whether it was sort of really cut and dry and super clear, or it's developed over time or in particular context? Here is what is and isn't okay for you when you're at work.
I love that question because it's not an easy one for me. I really have to think and reflect about that because relationships are really important. Connection is my primary value. So when I do our role, goal, soul exercise, connection is always a value that I think about. And so I start from a place of concern that my boundaries will limit my relationships. So for me, part of the practice is remembering that actually I can have a more authentic and a stronger relationship if I'm honest about what my boundaries are for myself, so that you and I can, and I don't just mean like me and you, Trina, but sure, you and I as me and whomever I'm trying to build a relationship with. If I'm really grounded in that connection to my own sense of my own boundaries, then we can share in a really powerful way. So it's such a big question for me. And I really have to dig deep because I think sometimes for any of us who are really relationship motivated, we can accidentally cross our own boundaries if we're not reflecting on what ours are.
Sure.
So there's a couple of things when I think specifically about race and gender and conversations about race and gender in the workplace that are okay and not okay for me. So being a queer person, questions about gender roles in relationship are not okay. They are not okay for me. They might be okay for other queer people. They're not okay for me because questions around gender roles reinforce gender violence. So when people find out that I'm dating someone, which I'm not right now, but when people might know that I'm dating someone and they might say something like, well, who wears the pants, or who's the man, or who's in charge and who sort of plays like the mom role.
Right. Or like, how does that work?
Right. It is curiosity about something that I think is no one's business because it's not even an interesting enough question to know about how me and the person that I'm in a relationship with go together and make each other's lives more interesting and full and joyful and vibrant. So it boils relationships for me down to something that is so inessential. So when I think about gender roles I perform a really big mixed bag of traditionally masculine and traditionally, and I'm putting those in air quotes, feminine gender roles. And so you've just diluted my whole relationship down to boxes that people could fit in. And that for me replicates gender violence in the workplace because it says that is a framework for how we're going to treat people that we've assumed are men or assumed are women in the workplace. And we've distilled those people down to really singular gender binary roles. So that's one thing that's just not okay for me.
How has it helped you to know that boundary or to come to know that boundary for yourself before people say something like that to you or ask something like that to you? And I'm guessing that some of our listeners might even find it hard to believe that in this day and age that happens to you.
Swear to God it happens.
You speak on panels, you lead big meetings, you lead processes, you turn in writing. And so in some ways, sure, you're a public figure, but it usually happens one-on-one, right? And so how has it helped you to know before that interaction is going to occur that that's a boundary that you have?
It helps me not stay in conversations that feel wrong to me. So knowing it about myself, one, I can talk with my colleagues. So if I start to tell a group of folks that I'm dating someone or I'm in a relationship, I can say, and I know that sometimes gay couples get asked about roles. I'm not interested, nor am I willing to have a conversation about gender roles in my relationship. I'm happy to talk to you about how we met. I'm happy to talk to you about how we sort of improve each other's lives and bring more joy, et cetera, and things like that. I will not entertain questions that are rooted in stereotype and gender violence about the roles that we play in our relationship. And I don't have to do it in a overbearing way. I don't have to do it in a scary way or like a punishy kind of way. But if I know it about myself, it means I won't stick around in a conversation that feels gross for longer.
Yeah. Well, and I'm curious too, because boundaries go both ways. That idea of it tells us what we can allow in as well as what we're going to keep out of bounds in our relationship. So I'm curious, is there something that you were taught should be out of bounds that as you have progressed in your career have decided is in bounds for you right now?
I was taught that having a picture of yourself holding a glass of alcohol on the internet was professionally inappropriate. And I just believed that for a long time.
Sure.
And I no longer believe that because I think that people who would like to go in public and have a drink are allowed to do that. And I think we need to stop associating having a drink with wholesale inappropriate behaviors.
Right.
Which leads to, we could do a whole episode on how do you negotiate alcohol use at work functions.
Totally.
But for me, it was people just sort of gave me that early in my career. Like, don't have pictures of you holding a glass of wine on the internet. Why?
Right. So it's that arbitrariness of rules that we always assume, comes from good intent. When people are giving us advice, they want us to do well professionally. But one of the things I love about our consistent conversation about boundaries is we revisit and say, okay, what was the context then? Right? Oh, great. I was under 21 years old, and in the United States, it would be illegal. Okay, so maybe that's what they were trying to, but we don't even have to understand the intent. We just get to say, okay, I'm a grown-up now. I go to a lot of functions. I'm a person who feels responsible about my current relationship to alcohol. So no, I'm not going to hide it behind somebody's back in a photo, right? And you get to decide. But that idea that, again, one size fits all, like this just is the appropriate rule. And you're saying, is it? For me, I don't think so. And like you said, that matter of degrees, adults are smart. We can understand complexity. So I think that black and white thinking of either or, this is either just wholly in bounds or wholly out of bounds, doesn't make any sense.
Right. I think we have to take a little break. When we come back, I want to hear about your boundaries, and then maybe we can sketch out for folks, how would they ever begin this conversation at work?
Love to. Alfonso, we're about to get to do an episode of Behave live from a stage.
In real life, in front of people more than Levi.
Exactly. So if anybody here in the Bold North is within traveling distance to get to Minneapolis, we will be recording an episode of Behave at the upcoming Pollen Live event on Tuesday, February 11th, 2020. There are tickets still available.
We are super excited to do our first live event, and we're going to get to talk about one of our favorite topics. We haven't dug in a bunch, but you know that we are big social justice movement building nerds, and we're going to get to talk about what social movements are and how workplaces really need to pay attention to social movements. We're also having our first guest, our dear friend, our movement fam, our mentor, Beth Zemsky, is going to be on the stage with us at Pollen Live on February 11th. Talking with us about social movements and what are the implications for social movements as we head into 2020 and for workplaces.
So a big thank you to Pollen Midwest for having us. We hope to see you there.
Check it out at pollenmidwest.org/events. Welcome back. I want to hear about your boundaries, Trina, and I know that you probably have some examples of things that are in bounds for you and out of bounds for you. We'll hear from you, and then maybe you and I can reverse engineer, like, what would a first or early process look like for a team that wanted to get more explicit about what their boundaries are?
Sure. I think like you, my head is spinning because I have articulated so many sort of small or day-to-day operational boundaries with my team that I've really discovered for myself over time. So maybe one example is related to time. So I've consistently had jobs, and we live in the world right now where a lot of people think of one another as on call because we might have our phone in our pocket, we have access to the internet or somebody else's hotspot. So the fact that theoretically we could work if called upon is true for a bunch of us, depending on the job that we have. And I really struggled for a long time around boundaries with staff reaching out to me with non-emergencies, because they might have felt like an emergency to that person. And I've learned for myself that I really need to protect my time so that I can be good at work. So I've worked hard to really articulate and communicate to our current team what warrants a text message, what warrants a phone call, where you can make decisions without me or not when I'm scheduled to be away from the office. And so it's something I've really wrestled with. Like, this is the very first job I've had in 18 years where my cell phone number isn't in my email signature. And I didn't even come up with that boundary. Maria Isabel came up with it for me because she knew I needed help enforcing that boundary. And so I think maybe that's a lesson too, is that sometimes we can see one another struggle with a boundary. And so it's something I'm working on, and I'm going to keep revisiting depending on the kind of portfolio we have, the kind of time zones people are in. But I'm thinking a lot about how to actually protect my time, not just because, but because I'm better for our company when I have time to rest and breathe and not worry.
And what I love about what you're saying is the ways in which the same boundary can be contextual. So the boundary isn't never text Trina.
That's right.
Right?
Right.
The boundary is, let's have a plan for ways of using different forms of communication. And I know you're going to do one that's out of bounds, but I'm thinking about something we established early in creating the company, which was we don't send each other the subject line or the text that says, can we talk?
Oh my God, it's so scary.
Or do you have time to talk?
It's so scary.
It's like, who's ever been broken up with? Like,
it's so scary.
So we always give, or we try, I shouldn't say always, we try our best to, if we're asking for unexpected time, to give each other on our team the headline. So I think that's like one way that thing you just said manifests.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's not that there's singular rules. It's just always tell me what you want to talk about or for how long you think it's going to be. So I understand. Is this an emergency, right? Because we're in animal bodies and I take my responsibilities really seriously. So I can go from 0 to freak out pretty fast.
Well, and I go right to like, whose kid is sick? Like something's wrong with one of the children?
Yep. Yeah. Hospitals is usually what I think. Yeah. So it's those day-to-day things. Again, it's not just boundaries about like breaking the law, which, my gosh, that's a low bar, right? Like, I should hope. And that idea of on a daily basis, where do my edges need to be? in order for me to do my very best work. And again, that's about self-knowledge. You don't get to run around being mad at people for crossing your boundaries when you haven't articulated them.
Right.
And because of the way that race, gender, class, and age work, we might need help or a mechanism articulating, right? We don't just get to ride roughshod over people. I don't know what that means.
Yeah.
My parents have always said it. I've ridden a horse, but like it didn't go that great. You don't get to just blow through people's boundaries and then say, oopsie daisy, I didn't know. You have to take responsibility. But I also think that idea of saying, okay, there's a lot of different ways through regular meetings where you just bring it up, through writing some stuff down, through trying out some protocols, through having individual boundary conversations with each of your staff people. And I do think it's this cool way, this on-ramp into equity, right? The difference between equality and equity is we all have the exact same boundaries. Well, here's the deal. We're all in totally different bodies, having lived a totally different life. So what if we revisited and said, here's where some of the hard edges are, and then here's all the wiggle room of where our boundaries can vary in between?
I know that you wanted to also talk about some things that are not okay for you. Do you have some examples of at work? What is something that's not okay for you?
Yeah, but I don't like talking about it. Yeah, let's talk about it. It's like our spiritual director says, what's the thing you least want to talk about on your list? And then I tell her, and she goes, let's start there. And I go, oh, bad connection. I'm going through a tunnel or a mountain. Okay, so here's why I don't like talking about this. And then here's why it's important to talk about it. So let's talk about boundaries as it relates to physical contact and women in the workplace.
Yes.
Okay. I'm a white woman. I'm about to turn 39. I'm gay. I've only ever been in my body. Right? So I am not now, nor am I ever, speaking for all women. I've noticed a pattern because in America, we are all over the place with how we meet and greet one another and how we say goodbye. So meaning I've been in cultural contexts where people just always only handshake or they kiss one another on the cheek. But you know how it's like not a kiss, it's just the like mouth noise.
It's like air.
It's like the mouth noise.
Mouth, cheek touching.
Right,
maybe.
it's like that.
Yeah.
Right. Where like your bodies aren't touching. So here it's super messy. And by that, I just mean you can't predict. So some people might shake hands. Some people might hug. They might do that like under hug or the over hug or the cross hug. It gets
I'm known for one over, one under.
Right. And I've seen dudes do the like hand thing with the back pat. You know what I'm talking about?
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
I'm
great.
familiar with the one.
Okay, great. So I never know what's happening.
Catholic school, all boys dorm.
Okay, great. So here's what's important to say. And I'm going to deal with the fact that I feel like I always need to offer a caveat. Physical touch is my love language. That doesn't mean I just like to be touched constantly. It means touch is really important to me, and it's a way that I'm in relationship with people. So I've noticed to my body that other people want to get closer to my body before we're in deep relationship than I do. So for example, you and I, as a man and woman-owned company, have walked into environments where we know the person the same level of well. Like they could be a total stranger, or they could be someone we both know pretty well. And people might shake your hand as a broad-shouldered, 6 foot tall plus man, and they come in for a hug from me. No, thank you. Part of that is I don't know you.
Right.
Or I don't know you like that.
Like when did we ask or when did we start this?
And so the fact for me that we are in the middle of a nationwide conversation about consent, and I have heard so much smart stuff articulated about physical touch and consent for young kids, right? There's this conversation about forcing kids to hug or not. And boy, as adults, we haven't figured it out. And so again, I don't want people to hear, don't ever hug Trina. That's not the point. But the point is I have noticed a relationship between how people talk to me, how I get paid, how people believe that I am or am not a decision maker based on how they experience my body as a woman and a leader. And so for me, it's not that you have to jump through hoops to earn the right to hug me, but it's got to make sense that we're hugging.
Right. And the simple, like, do you feel like a hug?
Totally. And so that's a boundary that I'm still wrestling with. And I hate that I don't feel like I can just put both feet on the ground and say, and here's why. Because again, I don't want to be like the staunch advocate for no touching, because that's not how I feel. It's not how I feel. But I just know that people have decided for me that the boundary is that they can have access to my body, and that doesn't sit well with my personal, political, spiritual, or physical boundaries.
Well, and tell me if this analysis is okay.
Yeah.
And then if it's like really not, we'll just cut it.
Okay. Thanks, Levi, in advance.
It sounds like people fixate on the hug.
Sure.
And it's the assumed access that's not okay.
Correct. Or the assumption that the access to a body like yours and a body like mine is different.
Right.
When, right, you and I walk in equal owners of this company, I have enough years under my belt just on the planet to be taken seriously. So it's like, I don't know why in this case you are assuming different access to me than him. Like, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
Well, in the ways that misogyny manifests, that it's like, it's all just, I'm just being familiar. And it's like, to one half of this team,
right,
that half that is a woman gets the most body amount,
right,
body to body touching.
Right. And if we're being honest, right, I'm a curvy woman and I'm 5'6". So also that idea of like, oh, and now we both know that you could physically overpower me. I'm not saying that's what anybody's thinking in their head, but when you get hugged by somebody over 6 feet and you're way under, you're like, whoa, you're very big up close. Right. And so it changes the dynamic. And I can't pretend that I'm not in my body while I'm trying to have really important conversations. So thank you for this opportunity to share gross. And there it is.
Well, thank you for sharing.
You're welcome.
I think that folks could probably, if you're new to a conversation about boundaries, it could sound overwhelming, or, you know, something we hear a lot of times is, well, how would we ever like have that conversation?
Totally.
Or like, when are we ever going to do our work? So,
oh my gosh, we have great tips for that.
Right. We're on purpose all the way telling the whole story about these boundaries that we have. The in the moment stuff happens a lot faster.
Yeah.
So folks will not be surprised that I'm going to say first, what is your goal? And what is your goal for yourself? So not as what is your goal for how the whole rest of your team should be,
right,
or how everyone who used to work with you or used to manage you should be. You're not near them anymore.
Yep.
In your current context, in the relationships that you have, given the power dynamics that there are, how would you like to establish particular boundaries for yourself?
Yeah.
And don't start sharing them till you're pretty certain that those are the right boundaries for right now. Yeah. For this context.
Totally. Well, and I love that, right, what you were alluding to is if you got to choose what was in bounds and out of bounds for you at work, what would your choices be? Not what are you stuck with, not this is just how it is here, but get in touch with what would I choose? And so I love that you're bringing us back to self-reflection, right? Because again, I can't go around asking for boundaries to be enforced that I can't articulate yet. And we've taught this before, but really the best practice when you want to start a conversation that may feel new to your team is offer first. So rather than walk into a room and say, I'm curious about everyone else's boundaries, right? Which is like, oh, what does that mean? Are there good ones and bad ones? Am I supposed to perform right now? I might come into a room and say, so I've really been thinking about how important it is for boundaries to be living and breathing. One of the boundaries I'd love to talk about is what we're using our Slack channel for, because I think things are getting muddy or confusing or we're missing each other. I know that I'm missing some things. So here's my recommendation or suggestion. And I have a boundary I realize I really haven't articulated, which is I need you to let me know if you're going to be more than 10 minutes late, because I'm actually going to get worried about your physical safety. Right. And so that idea that like, it's not okay for you to roll in late and not tell me what happened. Right. So it's like, it can be from the very benign day-to-day boundaries that everybody likes to talk about around like workplace refrigerators.
Right.
All the way to, hey, we're co-pilots on this really intense, complex project. How are we going to navigate decision-making? And, you know, what does that look like? And so boundaries for me set us free, because I don't have to tiptoe and wander around. I can be faster and I can sort of use this shorthand that we have now, because I'm not worried I might run into one, and I'm not resentful that you ran into mine. We actually just talk about it. And even from project to project, boundaries can shift.
Right. I think there's a next layer once folks have done some of that self-awareness and sort of offering of self. I think teams could, if they're feeling ready for it, have a team conversation.
Yeah.
That is about assumptions.
Yeah. Not
about telling other people how to be, like you said, but to dig into some of the workplace locations or opportunities where identity really matters. And identity matters all the time,
Constantly.
but there's a couple of examples that I'm thinking about that teams could talk about.
Sure.
So one is travel.
Yeah.
We know that men of color are overly policed in airports.
Gross.
And so you could have a conversation about how do you want to manage our relationship in airports across lines of race? Is there anything you want me to do or not do? Not here's how I can be a savior, or I've really read some of the articles about how men with brown eyes and beards, I'm one of those, are overly policed in airports, but say, given that I know, and we have this conversation all the time, given what I know that we are different races and different genders, anything that we should do or not do today at the airport. Another travel room.
We have that. I hold all your stuff and watch you if you go before me through security. So that idea that we have eyes on each other when we go through together, so that I'm sure you're not getting taken into a room to get searched for something.
Right.
And we do it vice versa.
Another travel boundary is about rooms.
Yeah.
So we might say, hey, I know we're staying at the same hotel. Do you want me to know what room you're in? Do you want to be on the same floor? Or do you want to be on different floors? Given I'm your supervisor and you work for me, given we're different ages, given we're different races, given we're different genders, like what feels okay for what we know or don't know about where each other are physically in the hotel.
Right. And I think I remember, so I've worked at a lot of LGBT organizations. And the thing I thought was funny, because often boundaries aren't revisited because people are so often operating in total habit, right? There was an assumption that people would want to share rooms with the people of the same gender. And I was like, why is that the assumption, right? And that idea that often organizations will talk about what is or isn't worth it in terms of finances. But when we think about how much better rested our team is when they were able to sleep in a room without one of their colleagues, regardless of gender or who snores or who doesn't, right? So part of it is this paradigm shift to why are we operating out of such scarcity that we're pretending the old way is what it has to be? And why are you making wholesale assumptions for your entire team about what you're just certain people would prefer or not prefer? You got to ask.
Right. Check in and have the conversation. Another area that teams could talk about is spending money on behalf of the company.
Ooh,
so we can make a lot of class assumptions around what people are comfortable spending, if they're willing and able to use their own money. Like if someone even has enough cash, we don't know. We might know what someone's salary is, but we don't know what responsibilities or commitments they have for their own money. So floating even $1 for the company might not work for whatever their cash plan is. I don't need to know their plan. I just need to know, is floating cash inbounds or out of bounds for you? Okay or not okay for you? What things do you feel like, if you have a company credit card, do you feel like you can just go spend versus not spend? Like actually talking all the way out, given my class, my story, my relationship to money, what might I feel is okay or not okay to do with money related to my job?
I want to dig into something you just said. You said, I don't even need to know. And I think I want to zoom in on that because I think it's really important around boundaries. You do not have to justify why something doesn't feel okay for you.
Right.
You don't need a perfectly articulated reason, right? And you don't need to stand for, well, that's not how I would do it, so I'm going to now convince you that this is inside your bounds. It's like, absolutely, we can have conversations about matters of degrees. But I really appreciate, right? We've talked before that one of the ways that privilege manifests in the workplace is we think that we should have access to a lot of information that maybe isn't ours to have. And so that idea that I don't need to know why in order to respect your boundary when you tell it to me. I don't need to understand your reason.
The last one I want to talk about as an opportunity, and there's all kinds of different doors and windows you could come in through. And I think what is really important here is you're always wanting to be paying attention to the reality of power, both personal power and identity power. And so it might be easier or harder given the identity someone has or the position they have in the organization to have this conversation. So having any conversation about boundaries, power is present.
Right.
And so how can we talk about it instead of around it? Or like try to, in a fake way, suspend the reality that different people experience the world differently because of how power works. So this last one, and it has happened to me before, but the sharing of articles that are about identity. I think sometimes when we're doing our own work, we articles, podcasts, research. I don't just mean like PDFs, like resources about people's experience of identity at work. I think sometimes we're so excited when we're doing our own work that we start handing other people book chapters, PDFs, podcasts without asking, hey, what is okay and not okay for what I share with you? Yeah. So for example, I'm doing my own identity development around being a Latinx person living in America right now. What's not okay is for people to send me stuff that isn't on my current reading list around Latino identity development. Yeah. It's not okay for me right now. Maybe at some other point in my life it will be. And so I think one of the ways we exacerbate that sort of othering in the workplace is I'm so excited that I did my ally work or some ally work around misogyny and sexism. Trina, look at this really painful article about gender violence in the workplace. You should read it.
No, thank you. I'm all set.
So do you know if your colleagues want you to show them the things that you're doing for homework? Yeah. It's okay to be excited. I'm glad you're doing your work. Ask what people's boundaries are around sharing resources related to identity and culture.
Exactly. And I love that so many organizations right now, ourselves included, really self-identify as being learning organizations. So what are the edges around that so that it's not just messy and on the side? Decide, So for example, our team once a month has what we call a learning meeting. And so that's the free-for-all space to share, but to really share in a context, not sort of through side channels, handing stuff to each other. And so I love that most of today's conversation has really invited people into their context and their relationship and their complexity. So we don't need to operate by old or arbitrary rules. We should always investigate. And I think just so folks know, our team has a practice of revisiting. So 8 months ago, we had a full team conversation about our internal boundaries. So for ourselves and with each other. And we talked it through so that we're sure that we had shared understanding. We've added to our team since then. So just last week, we decided we are revisiting. We actually do it tomorrow. And maybe things will have changed. Maybe they will have been added. Maybe some stuff gets dropped. But it should be a living and breathing conversation. This is not set it and forget it. Boundaries just stay the same.
We're curious, how are you exploring the topic of boundaries with your team? How are you thinking about, talking about what is okay and what is not okay? As always, please tweet us at Team Dynamics LLC. Send us an email with any questions you have, team@teamdynamicsmn.com. Thanks for hanging out today. Make good choices. Behave is produced by Levi Weinhagen in Studio G at the Glenn Nelson Center.
In my mind, that's the sound of that poor little girl in the animated movie, The Rescuers, getting lowered down in the bucket.
Oh my God. Dark.
I don't like. I watched it too early.